first tonight, the real story of the economy right now that goes to the heart of the cost of living crisis is that we're in a household recession. This is now the case for the 7th consecutive quarter in a row. It's a record. It's measured by GDP per capita. Now, there's a lot of spin in politics, but the data doesn't lie. Australia, under the Albanese government, has also recorded its weakest annual growth since the 90s recession, apart from the pandemic lockdowns. Our economy grew by just 0.8% in the past year and just 0.3% in the 3 months to September. It's only government spending and high migration that's stopping us from falling into recession. But at a household level, as I said, we're now in a recession for a record number of months. It's a record we don't want here in Australia. Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor today describe these GDP figures as a nightmare.
These numbers are a nightmare, reflecting the nightmare Australians are facing in trying to make ends meet right now. This is the 7th consecutive quarter of GDP per capita going backwards. 7th consecutive quarter of a household recession. We've never seen that before. We haven't seen it before. It is absolutely diabolical. At the end of the day, what we're seeing is household standards of living collapsing in front of our eyes.
The government can sugarcoat all they want, but the fact is, as the Reserve Bank Governor keeps pointing out, it's the government's reckless spending that drives up inflation and therefore keeps interest rates higher for longer.
And as you know, as we've been speaking about, Australia's living standards are now worse than the rest of the world because other countries are emerging from this inflation crisis. Now, the Prime Minister was asked about this on Sunday, and this is the moment Albanese tried to blame our living standards on global inflation before being shown just how we were worse off than every other country.
But I want to show you this, some OECD data on household disposable income. It goes back to pre-COVID, right? So you can see the rise there. But why has, in Australia, household disposable income continued to go down over the last couple of years?
Well, we understand that people are doing it tough. Global inflation has had an impact. Now, inflation peaked higher and earlier overseas than it did here. But our focus has been on providing cost of living support.
Sorry to interrupt, but take a look at this. You talk about the global factor. Other countries, Canada, the OECD average, the US, they're doing better than Australia with disposable income. Why is that?
Because, David, if you look at the middle of the graph, it tells you the story. Inflation peaked higher and earlier overseas than it did here.
Yeah, global inflation, it's a convenient answer until he's shown that other countries are handling this better than us. And it's not just families hurting, but businesses too are struggling, as Liberal MP Zoe McKenzie said today.
The country is in recession, and you just need to ask the more than 20,000 businesses that have gone out of business since this government was elected to know that everything is heading in the wrong direction. I can't see anyone taking any comfort in any of the figures, frankly, coming out of this government's maladministration of the economy.
Well, Treasurer Jim Chalmers admitted that there were expectations the GDP figures today would start to show a turnaround. And across the industry, there was a wide expectation the economy would start to show green shoots and grow again. Facing the press today, Chalmers was realistic about the data. He said the growth was weak and slow.
It's weighed down by interest rates and cost of living pressures and global economic uncertainty as well. Now, Australians would be much worse off and growth in our economy would be even weaker without our responsible and balanced approach to the budget and without our cost of living support.
But he said there was an encouraging aspect of the data that wages are growing, and they grew by 0.2% in the quarter. And this is true that wages are now growing, not falling, even if it is by 0.2%. But the problem is that wages growth is largely eroded by bracket creep. Economists are concerned about how much of the increase in government tax revenue is because of bracket creep. Middle Australia is paying more taxes while wages only grew 0.2%. And at the same time, government spending hit a record high. That means no government has ever spent more money than the Albanese government, at a time when economists and even the RBA has been begging the government to rein in spending to tame inflation. Well, the Fin Review's economics editor John Keogh says the national accounts are grim reading his words, and he says indisputably worse than expected. And he wrote today that the private sector is even teetering on recession, and he says that it's bloated government spending and immigration that's keeping the economy afloat, even though it's barely afloat. John Keogh writes, no amount of lipstick on this pig can hide the economic stagnation. Government spending and immigration are not a sustainable way to expand a high productivity economy that lifts living standards and real incomes for Australians. But the reality is that without this government spending, the weakest annual growth since the 90s recession of 0.8% would have been much worse. In fact, if it wasn't for this government spending, we'd be in a recession. And economists are arguing that spending should be reined in. It's a point eminent economist Chris Richardson made here on this show last night when he said the government could be doing more to bring down spending.
The International Monetary Fund says if governments want to help their central banks fight inflation, then governments need to cut spending and raise taxes. Or in other words, if inflation is a problem of too much money chasing too little stuff, governments can help by taking money out of the system. Instead, most governments around the world, but particularly here in Australia, are doing the opposite.
And there's now speculation that because our economy is so weak, it could prompt the RBA to cut rates earlier than it would have. Now, that's pure speculation, and the RBA has given no indication that it plans to do that. But if it does do this, because our economy is so weak, Albanese, of course, will celebrate it and claim it's evidence of good economic management. He'll even use it to claim the cost of living crisis is over, when the reality is far from this. Many Australians are now facing a miserable Christmas, unable to afford to take even a local holiday and struggling to pay for Christmas presents for children. Their savings that they accumulated during the pandemic have been eaten up, used to pay for bills and basic household expenses. And according to new polling today, 1 in 3 Australians have gone without medicine, food or education in order to just meet their rental payments or their mortgage over the past 12 months. This is a really sad state of affairs for our developed nation, going without food or medicine. And voters will hold this against the Prime Minister, as they should, because this is what he promised them.
Labor has a plan for a better future, a plan not just for them but for their children as well, for families, taking the pressure off the cost of childcare, the cost of electricity. A plan to address cost of living, take pressure off cost of living. Meaningful, ongoing help with the cost of living for families.
Yep, Albanese promised life would be more affordable over and over again. And as families now scratch around to pay for Christmas decorations, there's only one person they'll blame. And when they remember that Albanese promised life would be better while also pledging a new era of integrity in politics, well, there'll only be anger at the ballot box.